Alright, this is episode 7 of Battlebots previews and predictions. Good grief, what a good episode we saw last week. Bookended by two of the best fights I think I've ever seen. Valkyrie and Rotator really showed some insane durability against one another. Uppercut giving us a spectacular display, exploding Saw Blaze just about, and showing us what that weapon can really do. I honestly think Uppercut will end up being seeded perhaps first or second, especially with Tombstone copping a loss. The other fights we saw, Malice and Mad Cat, had a lot of potential but didn't quite end up delivering. Bit of a shame, but that's how robot combat goes sometimes. Sharko versus Slapbox perhaps over-delivered on what we were expecting. Gigabyte Extinguisher, that's about what we were expecting, right? Tantrum was great against Atom. It survived a strong hit and was well driven enough to dominate that fight in the aftermath. And Pain Train versus Smee was an intriguing decision after a fight with a surprising amount of damage. Alright, so the top 32 is looking very open right now. Remember, it's over half of the robots in the field making it to the tournament, so we can perhaps expect most of the veterans to make it, and quite a few smokies as well. Let's see how things continue to shape out in episode 7. Good thing Kurt Durgeon's a glutton for punishment, because he's facing against another horizontal spinner. This is a fight between two robots that have some of the worst records in Battlebots history. We've got Captain Shrederator coming into this at 2 wins and 10 losses for their career, and Axe Backwards with 1 win and 8 losses. Both are 0-1 for the season, and with those sort of histories, they're going to need to do something impressive to get into the top 32. Having said that, I think we might be seeing a return to form for the Captain Shrederator boys this season. Their loss against Lockjaw wasn't actually that bad. They managed to do quite a bit of damage to Donald Hudson's robot. They split the wedge, they put a stop to that weapon. They survived quite some time and got very unlucky once they got hung up on the screws. However, problems with the weapon continued to persist. Axe Backwards, on the other hand, got slaughtered by Malice. But on the bright side, I think this is the first time we've seen that weapon working since 2018. I've always wanted to see that weapon cause some sort of an upset. At the top of the preview for this battle, I alluded to the fact that Axe Backwards has gone against a few horizontal spinners. Of course, we've seen Malice this season completely wreck it. Texas Twister last season dismantled Axe Backwards, and the only one that they've really stood up to was Marvin, which ended up beating them in a judge's decision. So they've definitely had a rough time of it against this sort of weapon. Captain Shrederator, meanwhile, obviously hasn't fought this type of robot before because Axe Backwards is the only one of its kind. They have fought a lot of vertical spinners, however, and while it's difficult to rate it against any sort of weapon type since they have a pretty poor record in general, the thing is, I think we're seeing a more reliable Captain Shrederator this season. As we learned in episode 1, they've changed up the weapon system to an older style setup, and one that has proved to be more reliable in the past. They still ended up smoking out against Lockjaw, but hopefully those are just teething issues for the new old system, so to speak. So for this matchup, we've seen Axe Backwards modify their setup in the past. Against Marvin, they went in with those larger wheels that were used to dampen the hits that Marvin could land and protect the actual body of the robot. However, recently in the 2019 Orlando Maker Fair, we have seen Axe Backwards come in with a scoop as its main form of attacking, since high energy spinners aren't allowed there. So if they have brought that scoop to Battlebots 2020, I recommend they put it on for this fight, but they didn't for Malice, so I'm not sure whether they actually brought it along. It's hard to say. Even then, I think Axe Backwards is still going to be vulnerable to the energy that Captain Shrederator can spit out. I'm not really able to see Kurt landing too many effective hits with his weapon, especially against a robot as low as Captain Shrederator. I also think, of course, with the wheels exposed and encompassing such a large area of the robot, he's going to be very vulnerable to Captain Shrederator hitting those. We also have to remember that despite its record, Captain Shrederator is a very, very good robot. We've seen it perform in China, and that competition is no joke, you know?
Oh, do you want to win? This is a proven winner.
Yeah.
They've beaten some very competent robots over there, so we know that there is potential behind all the technical difficulties. Axe Backwards, meanwhile, is still trying to prove that the concept of the robot still works in modern Battlebots. I don't think this iteration is going to work out for them once again, which is such a shame to say because I love the design, but I have to go with Captain Shrederator on this one. And I think it's going to be by knockout. So this would put Captain Shrederator at 1-1, a definite chance of making the top 32, especially if they knock Axe Backwards out here. We know that the top 32 is very open this season, and with veterans like Shrederator, I reckon they could have a shot of actually getting up there. Axe Backwards at 0-2 is obviously going to fall by the wayside, I'm afraid. So it's kind of weird to think about, but Aberrant Robotics is already in their 3rd season of Battlebots. Luke Bittenbinder brought Parallax in Season 3, and it was a little known robot. It only got 2 matches, it lost both of them, and neither of them were aired. Luke then changed up the design from a drum-spinning wedge to a front-hinged flipper designed to look like a race car. The significant branding change earned them 1 televised fight against SubZero, where they were tossed out of the arena. And overall in Season 4, they went 0-3. Luke Bittenbinder couldn't make it this season, so Brandon Zielinski takes over as captain, so it's going to be interesting to see how he handles driving. We haven't seen P1 yet this year, so I think the assumptions are that a lot like last season, it might get a couple of untelevised fights, which would be a shame because it's a cool looking robot and we don't have any other front hinged flippers in Battlebots these days. But the good news is that it does get a televised fight here. The bad news for P1 is that it's against Copperhead. Zach Goff has already proved the strength of this robot's weapon by decapitating Gigabyte, and this was already off the back of a fairly strong performance in Season 4. Copperhead now seems a lot more refined than it was that season, and so as a former top 8 team with Poison Arrow, Caustic Creations seems to be on its way to its first finals berth since Season 2. Neither team has really fought another robot of the other one's type, so it's kind of hard to say how each one will go here, especially since P1 is such a rare type. But we did see P1 struggle to get underneath SubZero in its 1 televised fight last season, but of course now we have a different iteration of P1, and of course the floor has much fewer seams these days. I'm honestly not sure what can happen here for P1. They can flip Copperhead over, maybe get it pinned against the wall or something like that. We saw it against Gruff last season when it was flipped over. Copperhead was eventually able to self-right, but it indeed was the most vulnerable position it found itself in during that fight. The issue for P1, however, is simply the amount of damage that Copperhead can do. I don't know if P1 is durable enough to stand up to that drum. We've already seen in the Gigabyte fight that it's probably more powerful than it was even last season, and it was throwing robots left and right last season when it could actually get to grip with them. So Brandon Zielinski is going to have to be very, very careful if he decides to take Copperhead on head-on. This is going to be a real test for the durability of P1. It might also be a test of how it drives on only 3 wheels. There are robots who can do that fairly effectively, Whiplash for example, and have it not mess with the driving too much. But really, to be honest, I don't see Copperhead struggling too much with this fight. This is apparently P1's 2nd fight of the season, so hopefully any kinks that needed to be worked out have been, and Brandon is a little bit more experienced at the controls of P1 now, but from what I can gather, he's still a little inexperienced. P1 did appear at the 2019 Orlando Maker Fair, but I think it might have been Luke controlling it then and not Brandon. But yeah, I honestly think P1 will struggle with this fight. Copperhead is a veteran team, it is a proven robot, it does heaps of damage, and while Aberrant Robotics is becoming more and more experienced now, they're still finding it hard to fight their way out of the lower echelon of teams. So I reckon we'll see Copperhead go 2-0 fairly easily. I think it's going to be by knockout. To be honest, I'm really not sure about the durability of P1. But yeah, 2-0 for Copperhead. They will continue their march towards the top 32. I have no doubt that they will make it. P1 suffering a loss here against a good robot isn't the end of the world, but we're yet to see what the untelevised fight was. For the sake of P1, it was hopefully a victory, and at 1-1, P1 wouldn't be looking too bad, but at 0-2, if that untelevised fight was a loss, I think we can probably count P1 out for this season. But yeah, I feel like this one is fairly cut and dried. Okay, interesting choice here. Who decided that a modern day rematch between Kilohertz and Gnome 2 would be a good idea? So the lovable Rusty, the robot built of scrap, and with a very unconventional design and weapon built by Dave Eaton, he put in a very good performance back in episode 1, defeating Sporkinok, showing great speed and maneuverability, and the ability to self-riot also. It showed that on its own and against not much resistance, it's able to work pretty damn well, but this will definitely be its first test. Beta, on the other hand, also 1-0, but this was after a judge's decision against Rotator, and a controversial one at that, after a battle that has left us all still waiting for a good hit.
Oh, wait for a good hit.
Beta's comeback showing that it is just as durable and well driven as before, but other than that, we've not really seen much, particularly not from that hammer that has gone from being electric driven to now gas driven. So now, without Rotator's dangerous spinning weapon there to act as deterrent, I think we can expect a few hits from Beta in this fight. This is a very interesting matchup to give both robots. Sure, they're both 1-0, but I think we can all agree they come from very different tiers in terms of quality. Beta definitely has the more obvious route to victory, basically smash Rusty in the head several times until something shakes loose and it stops moving or just becomes flat as a pancake, whereas Rusty really needs to get that air hammer in a very good position to actually do any damage. In their regular setup, Beta's hammer mechanism is quite vulnerable. However, I think just to safeguard against any possibility, I think we'll see John Reed set Beta up in the same way as he did against Rotator, just to protect the hammer mechanism. Rusty's next best bet then is to perhaps get around the back, and if Rotator couldn't do that, I'm struggling to see Rusty doing that. Beta is obviously very well driven. John Reed is an incredibly experienced builder and driver. I can really see Rusty struggling to find a way in to actually land any effective attacks. Beta, on the other hand, well, I think they could probably hit Rusty on any part of the robot and expect something to happen, especially since Beta's hammer is an impact weapon that will shake things up rather than a precision weapon like the jackhammer on Rusty, designed to get at very specific targets. However, I think this is going to be a very entertaining fight. Rusty is a very mobile robot, so I can imagine it giving Beta a very difficult target for it to hit, but obviously it is just made out of scrap, and I can't imagine it holding up to the heavy blows by Beta. I'm going to have to say Beta by knockout. I'd be fascinated to hear the reasons behind anyone tipping Rusty in this fight. No disrespect to Dave Eaton, of course, but there is a gulf of experience and I think quality here. This would move Beta to 2-0, pretty much a lock for the top 32, I reckon. A returning veteran at that sort of a record, especially with a win against Rotator in the past. I can't see the selection committee passing up a 2-1 Beta if they were to lose the next fight. Rusty, on the other hand, goes to 1-1, and we'll just have to wait and see what it does in its third fight. Remembering that the top 32 is honestly quite open. Rusty could be one of those smokies that makes it in. Will, you just keep disappointing me, man, don't you?
Yes, dear.
So now we have a very interesting matchup. It's between Hypershock and Mammoth. It's not one that I really expected, but it's definitely a great opportunity for Mammoth to actually show that it can kick it with the big boys. Not that there's any bigger boy than Mammoth. Mammoth is coming off a very impressive and wild and unique victory in a battle against Huge. Thing is, however, Huge is not the most conventional of robots either, so that's why I say this is a fantastic test for Mammoth. We're going to see it against one of your more standard vertical spinners. And that vertical spinner is, of course, Hypershock, who, as I alluded to, has been disappointing once more. They had a main event against Gruff in a fight that was all-out attack versus a solid defense, and, well, the attack failed, the defense countered, but of course the main story was the continued unreliability of Hypershock.
His weapon's not spinning. I got nothing.
It looks like if it could just get going without having to think about its life every 5 seconds, this could probably be the most dangerous iteration of Hypershock we've seen. The robot seems fast and maneuverable. Will Bales' driving is as good as ever when it's unhampered. And I thought after Season 4, they got a couple of wins. Perhaps they were starting to actually get things sorted out. And maybe those gremlins are only there for one battle, perhaps a little bit like Valkyrie, but I don't know, we'll have to see. Mammoth has a bit of an odd history when it comes to fighting against vertical spinners. It had a very rough time against Uppercut last season, was very exposed to that weapon, and took a lot of damage against one who it didn't take that much damage, but one who was able to land a number of hits on the forks and the lower sections of Mammoth. And against Huge, it was able to keep Huge's spinning bar away from most of the important parts of the robot. Mammoth will need a very different setup to fight Hypershock than it did against Huge. I imagine that they have a pair of wedges, or perhaps one big wedge they can put on the front of the robot. I think the team understands a whole lot more now after last season, the precise geometry it takes to fight against different sorts of robots and to keep the important parts of their own robot protected. So I think they might be able to defend themselves, perhaps not for the full 3 minutes, but perhaps long enough to actually put a flip on Hypershock. And I am worried for Hypershock if they do cop too much of a battering from Mammoth, what can end up going wrong. I don't know, I've just sort of lost trust in that robot, I'm sad to say. I actually think if Hypershock gets tossed around too much by Mammoth, it will probably end up malfunctioning in some way or another. The caveat to all of this is, of course, if Hypershock does get a hit on Mammoth, as long as it gets enough purchase, it will cause untold damage. It will break the drivetrain, make the frame collapse, who knows what it could possibly do. But, you know, I actually am going to tip Mammoth. I think they can defend themselves for long enough to let Hypershock burn itself out, lose drive, lose the weapon, lose the self-writer perhaps. But yeah, call me crazy, but I think this is even going to be a knockout for Mammoth. And this will put Hypershock at 0-2. I think they'll be struggling from here. I don't know if the selection committee has the same trust in Hypershock to put on a good show if they do get given a top 32 berth at, say, 1-2 or even 0-3, as might happen with Rotator and Witch Doctor. A loss here, I think, means Hypershock misses the tournament. And a win, I reckon, guarantees Mammoth's spot in the tournament. It's a fantastic design, it's unique, and it's something that everyone probably wants to see more of. The selection committee will probably oblige. So, I don't know what's going on with this matchup, but I've got a lot to say. First of all, let's introduce the participants. We've got SubZero, a robot that's very familiar to us by now. They've been with us since Season 2, but have struggled to break into that upper echelon of robots. They've got a total career record of 3 wins and 7 losses, which isn't the worst of the worst, but it just shows how long they're taking to hit some form. We've just seen them pick up their 3rd career win against a newcomer called Grabot in a fight where SubZero showed us that they can absolutely control a battle if given the opportunity. Sporkinok, on the other hand, completely new to Battlebots. Although Lilith Spect has been competing in robot combat for a while, the first fight was up against Rusty. They lost that fight against Rusty despite looking like the more conventional design, but not without showing us a good top speed at the start of the fight and some good power in that weapon. As the fight wore on, however, they started to lose drive power or traction or something, and the weapon was stuck in the upright position, so Rusty took the win. So, now, okay, this might be one of the more innocuous fights to be critical of. I'm just not sure what the selection committee is thinking here, putting SubZero up against Spokenok. We've already seen them fight against 2 newcomers, Jackpot and Grabot. They got a little unlucky against Jackpot where they broke down, and they dominated the fight against Grabot. So maybe unless Spokenok had a really impressive victory that wasn't televised, that we're not seeing here, I just don't understand the logic of putting SubZero, a veteran team, up against another set of newcomers. Like, what do they have to prove? This is the 3rd and final Fight Night battle for SubZero here, so it should really be a test to see whether or not they're up to scratch for the top 32. So why not put them up against a Scorpios or a Valkyrie or a Copperhead or something? Not an S tier robot, but one that is probably going to make the top 32 this year, just to see if SubZero is actually ready to take that next step. I know that matchmaking can be very difficult, they've got a lot to sort out, scheduling won't always line up necessarily, but surely there was a B tier robot that was just kicking about and they could have scheduled a fight with it against SubZero. But yeah, I'm expecting SubZero to win this. Their wins against Grabot and P1 in the past are enough to convince me that they can take on Spokenok here. I'm not convinced that Spokenok will last being flipped around since it showed a lack of reliability in its last fight. It would be nice to see them pull off an upset, or at least make SubZero work for this, make them have to self-right a couple of times at least, and while I don't want to be dismissive of any robot here, upsets have happened and will continue to happen. I don't know, it's just puzzling to me that this fight needs to happen. I'm expecting Spokenok to come into this fight, perhaps with the same configuration as it did against Rusty. Not sure if it can run upside down with the Sport configuration, and obviously that's an important factor in this fight, so I'm imagining that it'll come in with the lifter again. A win here to SubZero would obviously put it at 2-1, and I have no idea what that means for it. It would only be the third robot to have completed all 3 of its fights, but you know, I just don't know where it lands. 2 wins and 1 loss all against newcomers. What does that even show us? I think it will make the top 32, but they're not giving it the chance to bump up its seeding at all by putting it up against a robot that would give it a stronger strength of schedule. Sporkinok, on the other hand, would be at 0-2, and as I've said before, a newcomer at 0-2 is pretty much eliminated from the tournament. Hopefully it can impress enough here and in its 3rd fight to warrant coming back in a future season though. Anyway, I've got to get off this soapbox. Let's move on to the next fight. Here we have Battle 6, and it's between Forge and Farm Combat Robotics and Team Chimera, or in other words, Balespear and Tracer. This is Balespear's first fight of the season. The last time we saw them was all the way back in Season 3, where they didn't have much luck. They went 0-3 in purely untelevised matches. This is a team with a bit of experience, however. Earl Pancoast III started all the way back in 2016 and has been fighting on the circuit since then. This is a new look Balespear, a lot more rugged looking, it looks a lot more combat ready, but it still has that tractor-esque charm that it did in its previous incarnation. This is the only robot of its type with its main weapon, a pneumatic spike, the power of which has been upgraded to 2800 PSI for this season. And with that, they're hoping to invoke Farmageddon upon their foes. Tracer, on the other hand, copped a loss against Ribot in its first fight, where it found out that the lack of a self-righting mechanism or invertibility of the robot can be quite a big flaw in combat robotics. So that was an odd end to a battle these days, but hopefully that doesn't happen again to them. They did show that they had quite some power in that weapon, but sadly they couldn't sustain their right way upness to actually use it. Looking at this matchup specifically, Balespear hasn't actually been in a fight involving a vertical spinner unless you count its teammate for a tag team, Parallax. But if I were to guess, the general shape of the robot doesn't necessarily lend itself to being defensible against vertical spinners. The best shot for Balespear, I think, is to use that spike to get in at the side of Tracer. As you can see here, Tracer does have a gap in the armor through which you can see the wheels. I'm not sure how much damage that spike can do getting in there, but that is probably Balespear's best opportunity to actually disable Tracer. Otherwise, I don't see it actually penetrating Tracer's armor. Tracer, in the meantime, I think it's fairly simple. Just point the weapon at Balespear and hit it. Like, there are a lot of edges on Balespear that will catch, that will throw Balespear up into the air, that will do damage. I see this being a particularly simple fight for Tracer to win. The sad thing about this fight, however, is that we probably won't be able to see Tracer's mini-bot Needle in action, since that mechanism relies on the opponent having a low ground clearance, and Balespear can just run over the top of it. So the victory here for Tracer will put it at 1-1. In terms of top 32 hopes, I think it really needs a victory against a pretty well-performing team in its 3rd fight. Balespear will end up at 0-1 after this fight if all goes as I predict it to, and from there, you know, there's still hope, but it's not the best start losing to a newcomer. So now we have the main event, and it is the Battle of the Lifting Forks. Intriguingly enough, it is Whiplash versus Gruff. Whiplash, all the way back in episode 1, we saw come off a loss against Sawblaze. Nothing to be ashamed of there. It was a pretty poor matchup for Whiplash. Sawblaze is a very difficult robot to fight if you don't have an insanely powerful weapon. The strategy and driving were on point as usual, but the Vasquez family were just bested by a robot that counters theirs, I think. And here we see them go up against Gruff, the robot that, as we saw earlier in this video, roasted Hypershock, burnt out their motors, or just simply outlasted them, I'm not sure, but the result was the same. It ended up on 1-0. and Sam McAmis is finally seeing some return on that potential that Gruff showed last season. I guess it is kind of surprising to see a robot that went 1 and 3 last season get 2 main events in the following season, but I think that is justified given that Gruff lost to some very strong robots last season. It seems that the selection committee has paid attention to Gruff's performance outside of Battlebots, for example in Robo Games and in the Orlando Mako Fair, where it has shown that it can go toe-to-toe with some of the best. They haven't really matched Whiplash up with many controlling or defensive type robots in the past. The only ones that I can see are Hyperthermia and Warhead, and I guess you could consider Sawblaze amongst them as well. So on most of these occasions, Matt Vasquez has shown that he can get around to the sides, do some damage to more vulnerable areas, and generally take control of a battle against this type of robot. Gruff on the other hand has mainly fought spinners during Battlebots, but we have seen it fight against some control sort of robots in Robo Games. It beat Swamp Thing early on in Robo Games 2018, but I'd say Whiplash is a more agile robot than Swamp Thing. This matchup is going to make for a very intriguing battle, one where driving is absolutely key. Since both robots can self-right pretty quickly, I don't see Whiplash doing too much damage to Gruff. It is a very tough robot, and Whiplash's vertical spinner is definitely on the smaller side. I'd say Whiplash is definitely fast enough to dodge out of the way of the flames of Gruff, and agile enough to escape the clutches of Gruff if it tries to pin Whiplash in place. Gruff has shown some vulnerability in the past to robots trying to get around their sides, and that is most definitely something Matt Vasquez will try to exploit. I think Gruff's best chance is to probably try and be as defensive as possible, almost sit in place and wait for Whiplash to choose an angle of attack and then just make sure the front is pointed at Whiplash at all times. The reason being, I reckon Sam wants to take this fight head on way more than Matt Vasquez does. I'd say Gruff probably has a better chance of getting underneath Whiplash, and the sides of Gruff are much more vulnerable. The way I see this playing out, I think Whiplash will honestly take this fight. It'll probably end up being a judge's decision. I don't see Whiplash being able to knock out a tough robot like Gruff, but I do see them getting around to the side way more often, taking control of the fight, laying some hits on Gruff, showing more aggression, perhaps even doing some damage, and ultimately evening the ledger for these two robots at 1 and 1 apiece. Neither of these robots should be too worried about slipping outside of the top 32 if they do end up going 1 and 2 on the competition, so a loss here for Gruff isn't the worst. Whiplash really wants to avoid going 0 and 3 though, of course. That would be pretty damning, so the stakes are definitely higher in this fight for the Vasquez family than it is for Sam. However, as I said, both of them on 1 and 1, I'd say they're looking pretty solid, but Gruff definitely has a chance here to take a much higher seeding than we might have perhaps expected at the start of the competition if they do indeed win this match. But I'd say it's Whiplash to stabilize their season and perhaps even go into their next fight looking for a top 10 seed. Alright, that is it for episode 7 of Battlebots. Thank you for watching my previews, thank you for listening to my predictions. I don't honestly think we're in for as exciting an episode as we were last week, but as the round of 32 looms, the stakes will keep getting higher, the tension will start to build, and we've got some seriously crucial matches coming up in this episode. So just to recap my predictions, we've got the first 6 all by knockout: Captain Shrederator, Copperhead, Beta, Mammoth, SubZero, and Tracer. And for the main event, I'm going Whiplash by judge's decision. Well done, you made it to the end of the video. Reward yourself by leaving a like and a comment and all that kind of stuff, because you deserve it. See you next time.